Max the Bad Talking Parrot by Patricia, Brennan, Demuth. Max was Tilly's parrot. He lived with Tilly on the bottom floor of a cozy two-story house. Their best friend, Mrs. Goosebump, lived on the floor above them. See those cars? Mrs. Goosebump worked nights at a toll booth. All night long she sat alone in the small booth with no one to talk to except the drivers who stopped to pay their tolls. So when work was done, Mrs. Goosebump liked nothing better than to visit with Max and Tilly. Each morning, when Max heard the doorbell, he would say, 9 o'clock, on the nose, Mrs. Goosebump, I suppose. And this is Tilly. Tilly would say, I suppose. And sure enough, it was always Mrs. Goosebump. Hello, dearies, Mrs. Goosebump would call as she waltzed in. Tilly would kiss her on the cheek, and Max would fly to her and say, would you let me take your hat? Sit a while and have a chat. Max would hang Mrs. Goosebump's hat on a peg, and then he would say, do sit in the wicker rocker by the big old ticker-tocker. There was something special about Max, which you may have already noticed. Max talked in rhymes. When Mrs. Goosebump was comfortable, Tilly would make apple cinnamon tea, Mrs. Goosebump's favorite. Then Mrs. Goosebump would take a white bakery box out of her shopping bag. Max's eyes would grow big as he waited to see what was inside. Mrs. Goosebump always brought something with nuts because Max loved nuts. Max would perch on her shoulder then, and Mrs. Goosebump would feed him. Max would make up little rhymes like, I like nuts because they crunch, crunch a bunch, and you have a lunch. When the nuts were all gone, Max would snuggle down on Mrs. Goosebump's shoulder. Tilly and Mrs. Goosebump would finish their tea and talk about bowling, swimming, or the news in the newspaper. And that is how the three friends shared each morning, until the big problem with Max began. One morning, as Max woke from his nap, he heard Mrs. Goosebump say something terrible. He heard Mrs. Goosebump say, Max is an ugly bird. Instantly, Max flew to a far corner of the room. Mrs. Goosebump was startled. Why, Max, she said, did you have a bad dream? Max did not answer her. He headed straight for his cage and stayed there and didn't say anything, even when Mrs. Goosebump said, goodbye, Max. I hope nothing is wrong. All day long, Max paced up and down in his cage. Ugly. The more he thought about it, the worse he felt. The worse he felt, the grumpier he got. He wouldn't make up rhymes for Tilly during tidy-up time. He only ate half his seeds for dinner. Tilly hoped Max would be his old self in the morning. But the next morning, when Max heard the doorbell, he said, 9 o'clock, I suppose. Mrs. Goosebump, go blow your nose. Tilly was astonished. Max, she cried, what's gotten into you? She opened the door, and Mrs. Goosebump waltzed in, singing her usual, hello, dearies. But Max answered, I say, I chirp. Did someone burp? Mind your manners, Max, Tilly scolded. Mrs. Goosebump walked up to Max. Whatever is the matter? And Max turned his back to her. He did not take her hat or invite her to sit in the wicker rocker. And during tea, he did not come out of his cage to eat nuts and make up rhymes. The next day was no better. When Mrs. Goosebump brought out the bakery box, Max said, cupcake, bagel, cinnamon roll, your brain's as full as a donut hole. And the day after that, when Mrs. Goosebump waltzed in, Max said, keep your hat. It's a disgrace. It might look better over your face. And when Tilly brought out the apple cinnamon tea, Max said, would you like something to stink? I mean to drink. Well, Mrs. Goosebump had had enough. She glared at Max and said, I don't know what's wrong with you, Max, but I'm not putting up with any more of your bad talk. Tilly, Let's have our tea upstairs." "Well, I guess we'd better," said Tilly. She gave an angry look at Max, picked up the tray and the newspaper, and followed Mrs. Goosebump out the door. Max stomped back and forth in his cage. "Go up there, see if I care," he said to himself. But Max did care. He felt as empty as the empty apartment. Well, Max did not see how things could get any worse, but that night they did. While Tilly was bowling, a masked man crept into the apartment. A burglar! The man stuffed some of Tilly's things into a sack and went out. He came back with the sack empty. He filled it up once, again, and then twice. And on the third trip, he looked at Max, and he said, "Must be nuts," he muttered. But he grabbed Max's cage, too. He jammed it into the front seat of his van and sped away. In minutes, Tilly's apartment was far behind. The thief headed for the dark highway outside of town. Poor Max crouched down in his cage, as far from the burglar as he could get. The dark shadows of Tilly's things stuck out all around him. Max closed his eyes and wished that everything was back where it belonged, including himself. Then he felt the van begin to slow down, and then it stopped. Max opened his eyes. The burglar was rolling down the window. He reached into his pocket and handed out some money. Max heard a voice. 50 cents will be your change." That voice. Max would know that voice anywhere. It was Mrs. Goosebump. They must be at her toll booth. Max knew he had to act fast. As loudly as he could, Max said, "Howdy doody, you're a fruity." Mrs. Goosebump thought it was the burglar talking to her. "Did you just call me a fruity?" No, said the burglar. I said you're a cutie." The burglar shook his hand for his change. He wanted to get going. Then Max shouted, "Flying feathers and a hurricane! What flew in? A real flea brain!" Again, Mrs. Goosebump thought it was the burglar talking. "Flea brain? Is that what you called me?" No, said the burglar. I said, looks like rain." And then Max shouted, "Golly Nelly, something smelly." "Ooh!" roared Mrs. Goosebump. "Belly!" yelled the burglar. "Mine's empty. I'm hungry, so if you'll just give me my change." That moment, Max got really smart, and he said, "Do sit in the wicker rocker by the big old ticker talker." "What?" cried Mrs. Goosebump. "That's Max's rhyme." The burglar still had his hand out, but instead of putting the money into it, Mrs. Goosebump grabbed it, and she leaned far out of the toll booth. "Just a minute here. That chair you've got in your van, that chair looks like Tilly's rocker. And that grandfather's clock, why, that's Tilly's. And that voice I heard rhyming, what, that voice was Max. You are a burglar. I'm calling the police." As Mrs. Goosebump picked up the phone, the burglar stepped on the gas. The motor roared, tires screeched, the van smashed through the toll gate. Then sirens blared, lights flashed. Max thought the burglar might get away. But up ahead, a line of police cars appeared, and the van had to stop. As the burglar was being handcuffed, another police car raced up. Out jumped Mrs. Goosebump. "Here's our hero," she said, lifting Max's cage from the burglar's van. "This is Max. His quick thinking caught the burglar." She smiled at Max. Max fluffed up his feathers with pride. He nodded at Mrs. Goosebump and told the policeman, "Now Detective can top her. She's a smart burglar stopper." The policeman laughed. "Well, I'd say you partners make a fine team." Well, so they got a ride back home in the back of the police car. Max snuggled down on Mrs. Goosebump's shoulder. He felt safe and warm. But after a few minutes, he began to think about what had been bothering him all week. He scooted away from Mrs. Goosebump's cheek and said, "Do you still think I'm an ugly bird? You thought I was sleeping, but I overheard." Mrs. Goosebump looked shocked. "You overheard me say you were ugly? Well, I never said such a thing." For a long while, Mrs. Goosebump looked puzzled. Then she remembered something. "Max, the day you flew away from me, you thought I said you were ugly? Is that why you were acting so bad?" Max nodded. "Max, you should have talked to me," said Mrs. Goosebump. "Then I could have told you that you misunderstood. I did not say you were ugly. I said you were snuggly." Max's dark eyes blinked. "Snuggly," Mrs. Goosebump repeated. Max let out a low whistle. He rolled his eyes. He shifted back and forth on her shoulder, shaking his head. After a moment he said, "Ketchup on burgers, mustard on wieners. I'd better take my ears to the cleaners." Then he curled into the curve of Mrs. Goosebump's neck and winked at her. And Mrs. Goosebump winked back. And here they are back to their morning routine. And look, on the front page of the paper, it says local hero. Max was a hero. And they were all friends again. The end.